This video will be some of the notes that I would give typically in class discussing the 1920s and why it was considered a golden era of sorts. Um, here. So the 1920s is referred to by several terms, sometimes the Roaring Twenties, or the Jazz Age, or the Golden Twenties. And by many accounts, it was a prosperous time for America. Why? Well, World War One really left America in a better position than much of the world. Productivity had drastically increased by 50% through methods like scientific management and streamlining of assembly lines. Many consumer goods became available and increased in sales, so things like washing machines and dishwashers and vacuum cleaners made modern living more convenient. And if you couldn't afford these things, you could always, of course, buy them on credit, which became more popular in the 1920s. This idea that you could like buy on layaway or take credit to purchase things, which would clearly be disastrous in the future. The 1920s productivity led to an increase in wages and more leisure time. Corporate profits were very high as they studied each production in order to make it as efficient as possible. And this had benefits to many of the workers that an 8 hour workday simply became standard practice, and employees were paid more and had more purchasing power. Installment buying allowed for the larger purchases like automobiles. And for the most part of the 1920s, the government became very accepting of the practice of big business. But it's much different than the Gilded Age when factory owners were trying to basically get absolutely everything that they could out of their employees. In the 1920s, this idea came about that a happy employee was more efficient. And so ideas like paid time off became more acceptable, and an 8 hour workday became more acceptable without really these strong labor fights being necessary. And as a result, a lot of workplaces, treated their employees well, and the government essentially left businesses alone. Oh, great! You're going to get to hear a train. That's a little bit of Coal City for you. One area that was drastically increased by productivity was the automobile manufacturing industry, particularly the company Ford with the Model T. Now, the Model T is not the first car that people could buy. Like, there were models before it, but it was really the first affordable car that the masses could purchase. And they were mass produced, and they had a very streamlined process, including the color. There is a statement attributed to Henry Ford that the Model T comes in whatever color you would like, so long as it is black. And the lack of distinction in the color really just made the car easier to produce. Every car's body went through a black painting process. And there was a lot of study, and they were actually making Model Ts more efficiently than they make modern day cars today. Now, granted, a Model T is a little bit simpler, but it still was a very streamlined process where they could make a Model T every 10 seconds. And these affordable cars really started to change the demographics of America and led to the creation of suburbs where people would commute from their suburban communities into the city to go to work. And the Model T was revolutionary in that sort of change to American life. The 1920s also were a kind of a turned corner for women. The 19th Amendment was into effect with women's suffrage, and this cult of domesticity sort of mentality was fading a little bit. Women became more free and independent, and the stereotype of women of the 1920s is this image of a flapper. A flapper was a woman who had her own income, who went out to bars, speakeasies that we'll talk about in the Prohibition era. They danced, they smoked, they told dirty jokes. They were very free and independent. Now, were all women of the 1920s flappers? No, definitely not. Many women maintained a very typical American life, that they weren't going out and living this free and independent lifestyle. But the fact that a flapper existed in this time is still socially relevant. It's kind of like hippies in the 1960s. Not every person was a hippie practicing free love, but it was still a major part of the culture. So the fact that women were finding this degree of independence in the 1920s was notable. Women had also attached themselves to a variety of other causes. The vote was one thing, and more political participation for women. The 1920s, there were some fashion changes, the bobbing of the hair, but also the sort of abandonment of things like the corset being this very restricting article of clothing that would cinch their waist to try to make this hourglass figure was popular before the 1920s. In the 1920s, they started to sort of, criticize this practice and change the way that women, lived and dressed and had a lot more independence in a way. The 1920s also were a time of change for African Americans in this era. The Great Migration of World War One led many African Americans to move out of the South, out of a lot of these sharecropping type positions in the South, and move to the North into industry. And African American culture became more mainstream, particularly with the Harlem Renaissance. You even had some civil rights reformers taking, more pride in black culture, such as Marcus Garvey, who advocated for Afrocentrism. And so there was sort of new opportunity for African Americans, but let's not make the mistake that everything was golden racially in America. The Harlem Renaissance, was a growth of African American art, culture, and music. A lot of mainstream entertainers flourished in the African American culture. People like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, these jazz musicians became very mainstream at this time. You also, in the 1920s, due to the sort of the relaxing of the workplace, have a lot of free time, to be honest. The crossword puzzle was created at this time. The leisure activities like mahjong caught on, where you would set up all these tiles and sort of match it. Now, you might have played mahjong on a computer or a phone, but literally in the 1920s, people were setting up these tiles and matching them. You had more athletic pursuits like, for example, tennis, swimming became a more mainstream activity in the 1920s. So you had a lot more people with a lot more free time on their hands. The 1920s were also the era of celebrities. Mass media came into its golden days. So you had, the radio. You had, in the 1920s, movies, and a lot of them were silent films, but then evolved into, motion pictures. And this led to the growth of a lot of movie stars. Now, note on this screen, this particular movie, Al Jolson, the jazz singer. More on him in the next slide. So the figure on the left, this is Al Jolson, who was in The Jazz Singer. And this is a practice that in the 1920s grew on that was called blackface. So we discussed how African American culture was seen as popular and more mainstream. And people would pretend to be African American. But as you can see from Mr. Jolson, he is clearly not a black man. He is in makeup. And this was a practice that was seen as okay in the 1920s. I think that in the modern day, that's rather cringy, but still a practice that occurred then. The figure in the middle is Charlie Chaplin, one of the most famous figures of the silent film era. He played a character known as the Tramp. Silent film pictures, used a lot of slide cards to communicate text. They had a lot of, they would have actually sort of a script that would take place in the movie theater where different sound effects would be used to heighten the film. But Charlie Chaplin was a movie star of his era. The guy on the right, that is Rudolph Valentino, who was by many considered this very attractive and handsome actor. His crowning moment was this movie called The Sheik. But so movie stars became a thing in the 1920s. Also, you had athletes for the first time. Some of the best known names in sports came out of this era. Babe Ruth, obviously known for setting a home run record that stood for quite a time until Roger Maris broke it. So Babe Ruth. Lou Gehrig, who was known for consecutive games played with the New York Yankees. You also had Red Grange, who was AKA the galloping ghost of the Chicago Bears, which was one of the highest paid football players at the time. And so with this free time, you had people being able to follow sports and entertainment. Probably the largest celebrity to come out of the 1920s was not an athlete or an actor, but was a sort of pioneer of sorts. This is Charles Lindbergh, who was the first to fly in an airplane across the Atlantic Ocean in the plane Spirit of St. Louis. Pictured in the middle is him with his aircraft. In the middle is where he landed, I believe, in Paris, where crowds surrounded his plane. He was not only Time's Man of the Year, he was the first Man of the Year. So literally Time magazine started issuing that reward basically because to recognize Charles Lindbergh. Other little asides about the Lindbergh family. He was very famous for this pursuit. In fact, the year he flew across the Atlantic, the post office reports that he got more fan mail than there were letters to Santa Claus that year. But tragically, a few years after that, his infant child was stolen from his home. That criminal stole it to hold it for ransom, and the child was killed, and this launched an entire investigation into it. And this actually got the FBI to start taking on kidnapping cases and made that a federal crime. So that's sort of Lindbergh's story. So would you want to live in the 1920s? Why or why not? That is something to look into. How has industry evolved in production from the 1920s to now? What are the celebrities from today? How are they famous? And how is this different from the 1920s? So as we can see overall, I would say that the 1920s, from a distance, had a very positive look to them. You have more free time and things like that. You have a little more social acceptance. We'll talk about how, although there are changes, not everything is fixed. The Harlem Renaissance was a great moment for African American culture, but we're still looking at a segregated society. There were many instances of racial violence that occurred in the 1920s, such as the Tulsa Massacre. So the 1920s, are sometimes referred to as a golden year, or golden decade, I should say. But we'll see in future videos how it may not be so golden. Thank you.